Hi, my name is Hannah. Welcome back to my channel, Savage Reads, for the best video of the year. I am so excited to talk about my very favorite reads from 2024. So I have narrowed it down to 24 of my best nonfiction books from 2024, and I'm excited to talk about these books. If you can tell, I am in a new filming location today. For the holiday break, we have painted some rooms, and so this is the newly painted office. We'll be here for today. So let's jump into the 24 best nonfiction that I read in the past year. Starting off heavy, we have got Some People Need Killing, a memoir of murder in my country by Patricia Evangelista. This book is following the killings and the violence that took place in the name of Duterte's war on drugs in the Philippines. And it is a harrowing look at what happened and what is happening, and it is so important. Not only is it an important part in the history of the Philippines to understand what is going on there, but it is so important to understand how these kinds of ideas and how these kinds of leaders can come to power no matter where you are living. And so I highly recommend this. It is a must read if you can. It is a heavy book, but it is so important. So this year I have two 5-star books from the author Erik Larson, and he always does such a solid job at telling some interesting stories from history. And the first one I read was In the Garden of Beasts, Love, Terror, and an American Family in Hitler's Berlin. And this is following the family that went to be the ambassador to Germany in the lead up to World War II. And I thought that this was really fascinating. The only downside was that it probably focused on the daughter a little too much. I really thought this book was well done. It gave a very interesting perspective on the lead up to World War II, and I thought that it was really interesting. The other one that I read by the same author was The Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War. And this is another book that is leading into a war and what happens leading up to it. And I thought this one was really well done, a bit more wider in scope than the other book, because it didn't just focus on the one family like in the Garden of Beasts, but it focused on kind of the whole stage of what led up to the Civil War, and it was really well done, very interesting, highly recommend. For another book about war, I read To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 through 1918 by Adam Hochschild. And this was talking about the First World War. And the way that it approached this topic was so interesting because it was talking about the people who dissented, the people who refused to fight. And I thought that was a fascinating perspective, and the moral courage that some of these people showed through such strong pressure to stand up against something that they knew to be wrong when everyone wanted them to just go with it. And the consequences that they had in their lives, some of them were even killed because they refused to fight in a war that they found to be wrong. And so this was excellent. Adam Hochschild is just an automatic read now because this is the second book I've read from him where I felt like my life had been changed from this book. In a turn away from all these books about war, the book Our Native Bees, North America's Endangered Pollinators and the Fight to Save Them by Paige Embry was a very interesting read. You get to talk about the bees in North America, but also other pollinators, and you get to learn about why they're endangered and what we can do about it. It's just really fascinating and really enjoyable. So if you want a nonfiction that has important topics, but probably won't weigh you down as much as the war books, this one was great. Another amazing book that touches on war is Shadow Divers by Robert Kurson, and this is following two deep-sea divers as they stumble upon a German U-boat wreck and them trying to piece together the mystery, go on these dangerous dives to try to figure out who the people were who died there, why they were there. and getting to see the story of the people who were on the German U-boat and just these divers and their commitment to finding out the truth. This book was just gripping. For a book on some of our more modern problems, we have Cobalt Red, How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives by Siddhartha. And this book is following how cobalt is mined in the Congo and how it is so exploitative, and how we all want those precious metals for all of our smartphone batteries, and we need them in today's economy, but at what price? And it is such a good book. I highly recommend that you read King Leopold's Ghost or something of the sort first, so that you understand the history of the Congo, and then you really will understand what a tragedy it is that that kind of exploitation has continued through today. I think this book was tragic, but also so necessary. I read the book Into Siberia, George Kennan's Epic Journey Through the Brutal Frozen Heart of Russia by Gregory J. Wallance, and I didn't know what I was getting into. It's a man who learns about the exile system in Siberia, and I thought, okay, cool, that should be interesting, and I didn't realize how much I was going to love this book. And we start following this man who really is a proponent of the exile system. He thinks that it sounds like a great idea and is probably more humane than some of the punishment systems in the US. And when he goes out and actually sees what is going on, he changes his mind and he spends the rest of his life fighting against the exile system. And I just really loved seeing his moral strength in being able to see new information and really commit to change. And I thought that it was so inspiring that way, and so interesting talking about that kind of history and what was happening at the time. I not only found this book highly informative and interesting, I also found George Kennan to be very inspiring in some ways. Another book that was very eye-opening was Paradise Falls, The True Story of an Environmental Catastrophe by Keith O'Brien. And this is following a town by Niagara Falls in the 70s who found out that they had been poisoned by a chemical company that was putting chemical waste out into their town. And it is following the discovery and what people tried to do about it, and to understand just the devastation that the toxic waste disasters can cause on families and communities and can last for years and years. And so I thought this was really interesting and really important because I don't think it's a topic that has been resolved by any means. It is definitely something that continues to be an issue going into today. So I read a couple books that focused on Korea. I read Flawless, Lessons in Looks and Culture from the K-Beauty Capital by Elise Hu. And this is following just some of these K-Beauty trends and where they come from and why they are good, but also why they are toxic and what they are doing to people's perceptions of beauty. And it was fascinating to understand how things are in the culture in South Korea, but also to see how that is true in so many other places in the world, just at a slightly different degree. And so I thought this was very eye-opening. In reading this book, I was very inspired by some of the stories that she shared of women who were standing up against these kinds of standards, and that led me into reading the next book. The next book was Flowers of Fire, The Inside Story of South Korea's Feminist Movement and What It Means for Women's Rights Worldwide by Hawon. And oh my goodness, this book was so good. It didn't focus just on beauty standards like in Flawless, but it did focus on the feminist movement in South Korea and what that was in reaction to, and some of these horrible systems that are in place. And it was eye-opening and frustrating, but also just so normalized throughout the world. These things happen everywhere, and sometimes seeing it in a slightly different context can open your eyes to the injustices that are around you all the time. And so I thought this was really an interesting book, well written, and shed light on some very important problems. Now, for a fun book, if you can call a book that takes place through World War II a fun book, The Forgers spell a true story of Vermeer, Nazis, and the greatest art hoax of the 20th century by Edward Dolnick. And this is following a man who was able to pass off so many paintings as Vermeer's when they were forgeries. And I thought it was fascinating. I know some people might not want to get into all the nitty-gritty of how he managed to trick all these experts into thinking that these paintings were real, but I was like, give me more of this. It was so interesting, all the lengths he went and what you have to do to pass off these forgeries. This is the kind of true crime that I really do enjoy reading. The con artist and how he was able to pull it off, I thought it was really a fun read. Another excellent read was The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance by Rebecca Clarren. This book is part history, part memoir. This woman is confronting her past and her family's past as being Jewish immigrants on Native American land, and understanding the history behind that and the significance that it can have for her and her life. What I really loved about this book is not only did it give that history and her personal reckoning with it, but it gave suggestions for the future going forward, for not only for herself, what she is going to do to try to make things right, but suggestions that you could do in order to make things right going forward. And so I thought this was really well done and had a call to action that felt very repairing and healing. And so I loved that. This next book was fun, if you can call poisons and murder fun, but we have A Taste for Poison, 11 Deadly Molecules, and the Killers Who Used Them. And I thought this was really interesting, kind of the history of different poisons that have been used. It did manage to stay on the good side of the line where I feel comfortable with true crime books, because I don't want books that are glorifying killers or anything on that end. But this one, when it focused more on the methods, I thought was done pretty respectfully and very fascinating to learn about the different poisons that have been used. Next book was The Song of the Cell, An Exploration of Medicine and the New Human by Siddhartha Mukherjee. And he's just an automatic 5 stars at this point. His books are so fantastically researched and explained so well, and for a science book are so accessible that I highly recommend that you pick up any book by this author. I liked this one a lot. It talks a lot about genetics, and I was worried that it might kind of cross over too much and be just a repackaging of what he wrote in The Gene, but it was not. It was its own stuff. It was so fascinating. If you want to learn about the cell, this is where to go. I just can't say enough about Mukherjee and his ability to write about science in a very well done, informative, well-researched, engaging sort of way. It was great. For another book that was pretty good about con artists and thieves, we've got The Feather Thief, Beauty, Obsession, and the Natural History Heist of the Century by Kirk Wallace Johnson. This book mostly focused on the robbery of a bunch of rare birds from a natural history museum in order to use the feathers for Victorian fly tying. I didn't know that was a thing, but apparently that was a thing. It was very interesting to learn the history of this art of Victorian fly tying and to learn why people would pay money for this and how easy it was for this guy to go steal stuff and how he kind of got away with it and why that's significant for the future. And I enjoyed it. It was quite the ride. The author really got involved in trying to figure out what happened, and I had a good time. I enjoyed this one. If you want a nonfiction that isn't the most depressing thing that you'll ever read, this one was good. Did it have things that you're like, oh, I'm so depressed about humanity? Sure, but in a less horrible grand scale war sort of way. But on one that will depress you, we've got Seven Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City by Tanya Talaga. This is following the town of Thunder Bay, Ontario in Canada. Between 2000 and 2011, 7 Indigenous high school students died. This is going through each of their stories, and it talks a little bit about the residential school system and how, yes, they don't have that anymore, but the systems that they do have in place aren't there to protect the kids. It was a really interesting look to see how these human rights violations against Indigenous communities have continued even to today, and what we need to do to fix it. And so this was excellent and heartbreaking. Highly recommend, because these are topics that we all need to confront as a society. Another book that I enjoyed was Barron's Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry by Austin Frerick. And this was fascinating to see how certain individuals really gained a monopoly on different aspects of food production in the United States and how that affects how people eat and their health and how they live. I thought this book was fascinating, not only talking about the food chain issues, but also talking about how it affects rural communities and seeing how his hometown was very much gutted from these kinds of practices. Now, for a biography that I thought was excellent, I read King, A Life by Jonathan Eig, and this is following the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And this book does not flinch away from the difficult topics. It doesn't portray him as a saint. It also doesn't portray him as evil. It portrays him in a very human sort of way. Are there lots of things that you're going to come away with thinking, oh, I did not like that about him? Yes, but are you going to learn a lot about his ideas and the movement that he worked so hard for? Yes. I think this was a really fair and a really detailed portrait of King's life. Now we're on to memoir section. The first memoir that I want to talk about, I'm sure you have heard so much about this. It is How to Save Babylon by Safiya Sinclair, and this is the memoir of a girl who grew up in a very strict Rastafarian household. It was very interesting to learn more about Rasta, and it was also just so well written. She had that ability to tell things in a beautiful, poetic sort of prose, not only beautifully, but meaningfully, with real insight into her life. So I loved this memoir. Another memoir I want to talk about is Finding Me by Viola Davis. And this book is about the actor Viola Davis and her journey and her life. And I did not know a lot about Viola Davis, and what really impressed me is that she had important things to say, even if you don't really know her super well. If you haven't followed everything that she's been in, you can still read this book and gain a lot of insights that she has into life and her rising up through very difficult struggles and difficult family dynamics. And so that was a beautiful memoir. Another one from an actor that I just don't know super well is Not My Father's Son by Alan Cumming. And this was another book that had interesting things to say, even if you don't know the actor very well. And I think what really drew me to this book was the author trying to find his family roots and understand his family history. And I think that that is such an important journey to take, and watching him take that journey was really, really fun. So I loved this one and the insights that he had into his life and his family. Now, I also read Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. This book follows Frank in a very poor family in Ireland in Depression era, and just how he survived such horrible poverty and how he grew and moved on from that, seeing the struggles that his family went through. This was a really well done memoir and just an incredible portrait of what Ireland was like during this period. And finally, we have While You Were Out, an intimate family portrait of mental illness in an era of silence by Meg Kissinger. This book is following Meg's life and the mental health issues that her family had. And it also goes into her reporting later on with her focus on people with really severe mental health struggles. And I thought this book was really good in discussing mental health and showing kind of the ugly side of it, the scary side, but also showing that love that her family had for each other, even though they went through so many difficult things. And so it sheds light on some very important problems, but still manages to show a little bit of hope, that glimmer of hope with the support and the love that her family had for each other. And so this one was an excellent memoir. And that is what I have read the last year. Those are my 24 best nonfiction reads for 2024. If you have read any of these books, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Would you have put these on your best of list? And let me know, what are the best nonfiction books that you have read? I need more on my list. And so let me know in the comments down below. And I will see you all soon with another book wrap up.